Good morning. My name is Gerard Robinson. I am a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington, D.C., and I have the pleasure to have a Google Hangout event with three people. One's an author and two are respondents to talk about a brand new book. It's called The Split Screen Strategy: How to Turn Education into a Self-Improving System. And we have with us today the author of that book, Ted Kolderie. Many of you know Ted Kolderie as one of the intellectual thinkers of school reform, dating back to the early 1980s when he was involved in politics in the Minnesota area. He was one of the people who said if you want to make schools radically different, you have to think in a radically new way. And in his new book, he decided that we need to have a conversation about a self-improving system. For nearly 3 decades, we've had conversations about improving public policy. And by doing that, we can improve standards, we can improve metrics, we can also talk about accountability. But 3 decades later, we find out that that simply alone will not work. And so Ted decided to take a step back and come to the American public with a new idea. And that idea is that we need to turn public education into a self-improving system. Now, what exactly is a self-improving system? It's one that takes innovation and all the ideas that we know, and one that takes improvement. And it weds the two ideas so that we can have an honest dialogue about how to improve schools. We can do it from within, but we also need to make sure that innovation and improvement are at the forefront. As Ted said, it is a mistake to go assuming that public education can be better without schools having to be significantly different. No one is going to blow up the system and start over, but it is possible to make a school different by opening new and different ways of actually making the school work. And to think about it, we have to think about computing, communications, transportation, energy. Clearly, innovation, gradually improving and spreading is systemic change. And so we have today with us Ted Kolderie. We also have two people who will speak about the book. The first is Greg Richard. Greg Richard is the president and CEO of the National Association for Public Charter School Authorizers. He's in Chicago. His organization played a tremendous role in helping New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and also moving the nation ahead with thinking about how to work with charter schools in a smart way. Prior to working for the National Alliance for Public Charter School Authorizers from 1994 to 2005, he worked for the city of Chicago, where he played a tremendous role in helping open up new schools in the city. We also have Mary Catherine Richter, who is joining us from Minnesota today. She is the Executive Vice President for the American Federation of Children. She was unanimously, excuse me?
American Federation of Teachers.
What did I say?
Children.
Children, sorry about the American Federation of Teachers.
Yeah.
She was unanimously elected to that position July 2014 in Los Angeles, my former hometown. And she also spent time working in St. Paul, Minnesota in 2005 with the Federation for Teachers. And she's going to open. And then, of course, we have Greg. The way the format will work is Mary Catherine will speak 5 to 7 minutes to talk about the book, her ideas and perspective. Will then be followed by Greg, who will do the same thing for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll invite the author, Ted, to speak for approximately 10 minutes. And then we will open it up for a dialogue about the book. So with that, I turn it over to Mary Catherine. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for your time this morning. I'm really excited to be able to participate, so thanks for inviting me. And I really enjoyed reading through Ted's book and being able to talk about this split screen strategy. As a teacher, actually, the whole notion of a split screen strategy seems really natural because it seems like a natural approach to teaching as well, especially in a standards-based environment when I would think of both how to approach a lesson, also knowing that there was a standard involved. I think there's a natural tendency for teachers to think in split screens. So obviously I kind of I gravitated to the metaphor pretty quickly. I think also as a union leader, I have come both at my time in St. Paul and at the American Federation of Teachers, I have also come to understand that a split screen strategy is a really natural approach to lots of our most vexing issues. In some respects, I liken it to the idea in science, and I apologize to the science teachers out there. As an English teacher, I know sometimes we borrow your facts and turn them into metaphors, which I'm about to do. There is this idea of constants and variables in our world, and I feel like when we are working on improving education, we have a responsibility to identify the right constant. That's that thing that shouldn't change. That's that thing that means the most to us, our values, as it were, which means that variables then can be everything else. So, for example, if high school graduation is our constant, in other words, we want all students to graduate, that's not a variable, then the variables get to be perhaps the time it takes someone to graduate, the access they have to innovative programs to get to that graduation, etc. And so when in reading through Ted's idea of the split screen strategy and the idea that improvement would be that constant, so therefore the innovation gets to be the variable, I'm particularly drawn, as you can imagine, to chapter 9, where he talks about the making sure that more teachers have professional roles. One of the things in looking at my profession and what sort of drove me to take on teacher leadership in the first place was that we have created a system where we don't recognize the professional roles of teachers, and we actually don't represent a lot of the natural leadership roles they are bringing to their work or that we engage in on a regular basis. And so therefore, what happens when we're not actually starting with what is what might be a natural place for leadership or some natural ideas or creativity to tap into, is we spend a lot of time and energy trying to manufacture leadership roles or manufacture creative ideas or hand creative ideas off to teachers instead of co-constructing them with teachers. And I feel like a lot of our innovation energy is burned that way, as opposed to starting with where teachers are naturally animated about improving their work or seeing a problem and addressing it. So back to this split screen strategy, if asking, if wanting to recognize the professional roles of teachers is a constant for us, then obviously having a lot of variables to do that, but starting with the professional roles teachers ourselves identify in our work as the place where we can start assigning some deliberate responsibility and then sharing out from there. And so, I am really captivated by this idea of assigning more professional roles, because I actually do believe there is this beautiful balance that when teachers have autonomy, then the responsibilities a teacher takes on feel like a natural balance to that autonomy. When teachers have no decision-making authority, then the responsibilities heaped on teachers feel pretty oppressive and artificial, for that matter.
Okay. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah,
we'll
thank
turn
you.
it over to Greg.
Good morning. Thank you, Gerard, and all the guests and everyone joining us online. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about this important topic. I really want to start with thanking Ted and complimenting him on writing such a wonderful book. I found so many things in the book that I appreciated and supported and agreed with. And if there are any folks watching this at home that have not yet read, and not just read, but purchased, right, Ted? The split screen strategy, I strongly encourage you to pick up the book. I want to just touch on a few of the items that I wrote about that I found particularly meaningful to me. And beginning with the setup of the book. I'm going to read a few different passages because I think they're really well said and asked important questions. So Ted wrote right at the beginning, our current strategy has long been taught inside the box, trying to reach the nation's objectives while remaining within the traditional concept of system and school. And that very much resonated with me. Ted went on to write, the book is about the need to be skeptical about the challenge of improving public education and to be open to different routes. The central issue is, does the country go on working only to improve performance in existing schools, or should it be thinking what problems of performance are created by the system and school design? It is now time to be trying some different arrangements of system and school. And those passages greatly resonated with me. As Gerard mentioned at the top, I spent 10 years within the central office of the Chicago public school system, and often felt that the folks that were working in our district schools were working uphill. We're not getting the kind of support they needed from the central office, and that they were continually struggling if always forced to work within that system. So those passages resonated a great deal with me. The book talks about innovation. What are the components in any system? What are the components of an innovative system? Ted wrote, innovation gradually spreading is the way most successful systems change. So I really like that passage. Gradually spreading is the way most successful systems change. They're open to innovations. There are early adopters. No one is compelled to partake in the new innovation, and innovations improve as they spread. That felt very true to me. And I particularly liked some of the ideas in Chapter 7 around a need for better definition of achievement. Here I think is among many of the important points in the book, a better definition of achievement. Achievement, Ted wrote, quality is never one-dimensional. Achievement is also what you can do with what you know. Some achievement lies in non-cognitive knowledge and skills, and assessment should be multidimensional. So all of that was right on target. So many good things to like about the book, and I encourage everyone to read it. There were a few points in the book, that I would take issue with a bit, and that's when it got to how the charter school sector has been fitting in with this notion of innovation within the public education system. And here I thought the book was perhaps a bit too pessimistic about what's been happening in the charter school sector in terms of how it has been supporting innovation. Chapter 3 of the book is titled, intended to be an R&D sector, chartering has turned away from innovation. And just a few thoughts to share on that front. There's no question that chartering was intended to be an R&D system, but I would add that that was not the only intent of the charter school system. If you read the laws around the country, improving student learning is articulated in virtually every charter school law, encouraging the replication of high-performing schools, closing the achievement gap, allowing public schools freedom and flexibility in exchange for high levels of results. So those are also additional reasons for why charter schools came about. So yes, innovation is one of them, but there have been multiple reasons for it. And here I think I would just disagree with the notion that chartering has turned away from innovation. I think we've seen a lot of innovation within the charter space, starting with, well, compared to 25 years ago, we now have institutions in the country that are able to open new public schools other than school districts. That's a fundamental new innovation, that we no longer rely only on school districts for the creation of new schools. I think we've seen innovations on flexibility and staffing, on use of time, on the budget, we've seen innovations around blended learning. I would say, frankly, the no excuses model schools are innovations. Now, I realize they are innovations that some folks don't care for, but nonetheless an innovation. So I really do think there has been a great deal more innovation in the charter school community than we often acknowledge. And that innovation is a value that has been supported by leaders in the charter school community. The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools released a report a month or two ago around innovations in charter schools. My organization, we work with Authorizers. We have been all over the country working directly with Authorizers to create broad-based performance frameworks that look at multiple measures of academic and student achievement. The New Schools Venture Fund has several initiatives that support innovation. The Charter School Growth Fund has a fund dedicated to supporting next generation learning. So I do think that innovation is present in the charter school sector. I think we'd all like to see more of it. But to want more of it, it is not the same thing that has been abandoned. So I do think we can do more in this regard in the charter space, but it is happening, and we should acknowledge when it does happening. But fundamentally, the main points of the book, to be clear, I really agree with Ted's premise. We need a split screen strategy in education. We do need a track that is working on improving the existing schools, and we need another track that's open. It's an innovative system that can lead to better outcomes in the future. And in my opinion, I think we're seeing that in the charter school sector right now. I'd like to see more of it and find some new ways so that in the future we really can ensure that all kids have great schools to attend.
Thank you, Greg. So we've had a chance to hear from Mary Catherine, who talked about the role of a split screen strategy and teachers, the ones who do the work every day in our classrooms. And we also heard from Greg, who took a systems approach, both charter and non-charter. We're now going to turn it over to Ted Kolderie, who's the author of the book, and I want to welcome you to the Google chat. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Gerard, and I'm really glad to be here. And good to see Greg again, and Mary Catherine, who doesn't live too far away, at least weekends. One thing that I did want to point out to everybody is that the book is available several different ways. You can buy the hard copy that Gerard held up. You can go on Amazon and get it, or on Kindle or one of the others, and get it as an ebook. But if you want to just get it and read it for free, go on the website of Education Evolving, and you can either read it online or download it from there. So it is quite available. I do much. This has been the two together have done a good job of reviewing the book, and doesn't leave me a lot to do and to say here, except a few things. Chartering itself was, as Greg points out, an institutional, what I think it was an institutional innovation, and it does have multiple purposes, one of which, at least in the Minnesota law, which was copied widely around the country, was to generate new professional opportunities for teachers, which again is a kind of an innovation. Let me add just a few points, if I could, to what's been said in the reviews so far. Above all, I think I'm appealing in the book for a different process of system change. I've been so struck that the approach to date has been so heavily top down. There is this this concept that any change would have to be universal, that there is out there some kind of a one best model of school, one best approach to learning, that if we could just identify it and agree on it and impose it would solve the problems of learning. I'm arguing, as Greg I think quite nicely indicates, for a fundamentally different process of change, which is, I think, as I say in the book, the process by which successful systems change. And this really very heavily looks toward empowering and enabling the people and the organizations on the front line, which are the schools and the teachers in them. We do see this all around us. People are free to try things, to introduce new models. Some of them work, some of them don't. Those that don't are usually closed down fairly quickly. Those that do are gradually improved and gradually spread. And we don't have in this country agonized national debates about whether everybody must drive petroleum-powered stick-shift cars on the one hand or hybrid cars on the other. We don't have agonized national debates about whether everybody must be on hardline phones or must drop hardline phones and go over to cell phones. These are people who want the new and different, are free to move to that, and many do, even though at the beginning many of these inventions are not spectacularly high quality. Nobody is compelled to adopt the new and different. Those who prefer the traditional may stay with that, but they're just not allowed to suppress the innovative for the people who do want that. And this is the process that works. In the reactions I've gotten, I find that one of the most difficult things is to clarify the concept of innovation. Let me say just a word about that. There is a tendency, I think, to feel that the first new model that comes along is the innovation. People get vested in that, and it's hard to change and go beyond that. I'm conceiving of innovation, invention, replication, improvement as a spectrum and as a gradually expanding process, but it really does need to begin in the schools. One of the things I'm trying hardest to do in the conversations everywhere and even around the city is to make it clear to people who are thinking about and are primarily concerned about improvement and progress in the district sector, the extent to which everything they hope for in the district sector depends on innovation succeeding in the chartered sector. I think it's clear that without the proof of concept and without the, to be candid, the enrollment pressure that comes from choice in the chartered sector, the good leaders in the district sector don't have much chance, realistically, of prevailing against the internal pressures in the district sector for sameness across the schools and through time. I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that change is not optional. Once in a while you do find people who think that if we don't change, everything will go on the way it has been. This is probably no longer true. School no longer has a monopoly on learning. Young people have lots of ways these days to learn, and you can see the potential for a bypass around school. New and different ways for young people or anybody to learn, somebody to assess and validate what they've learned, and a willingness to accept those validations on the part of whatever organization or institution the student wants to get into next. And there is a potential for that to develop. Nothing about that happening would protect or preserve the principles of public education, but that wouldn't necessarily stop its happening. So I am appealing in the book for people in the policy world to start thinking now about how to create what Paul Kennedy in his book nicely calls a climate of encouragement for innovation. Mm-hmm. I think we're at a point now with the new legislation in Congress where it's clear that the Secretary of Education will not be the nation's school superintendent. And the role of the federal government can change to encouraging the states to create this climate of encouragement for innovation. I said again in the book the same thing I said in what I wrote for Will Marshall back in 1990 or 92, that it seems strange that a president serious about education would not talk to the legislatures of the states that in fact control the education law and have the capacity to reshape the system. I hope that sort of thing will happen. The next stage, I think, are discussions with policy people about how to create that space, that autonomy for those schools and those teachers who want to try things that do depart from the traditional givens of conventional school. So let's move to discussions about that. Thank you, Gerard.
Oh, thank you, Ted. Oh, thank you, Ted. One of the things I find particularly intriguing about your book is the concept of a self-improving system. And we know from change theory and literature that institutions are just tough to change in general. And for a host of reasons, public institutions are particularly tough to change, whether we believe it's the old loose coupling concept or whether we believe that change has to come from outside. You really talk a lot about self-improving system. Tell us a little bit more about that and how that drives your thinking about a split screen strategy.
Well, I said a few things about this. I maybe don't need to say any more than that this does seem to me to be the process we all observe all the time as we interact with communication systems, transportation systems, energy systems, housing systems. We can see this process operating, and it seems fairly clear. It depends on, and I tell a number of the stories in the book, you know, whether it's about Marty Cooper fighting against the other people inside Motorola to develop a cell phone, or the fellow in the 1930s who wondered why it wouldn't be simpler just to lift the trailer off of his truck and put it on the ship, instead of unloading the trailer, loading the ship, unloading the ship. You know, these are outsiders, these are outliers, but this is the process. If there's anything I really want to stress, it's the importance of just letting people try things. Schools and the teachers, don't make them, but allow them, encourage them, and don't ask them to prove ahead of time, either to explain ahead of time necessarily what they're going to do. They may not know. Don't make them ask and get permission. If you ask them to get permission, then the people who are giving the permission have accepted the responsibility for what happens, and they will want to protect their own interests, and therefore they will narrow the authority given. The key thing that I think lies ahead of us is to personalize and individualize learning for the students, to get beyond whole group instruction. Over and over and over on television and magazines and newspapers, we see this whole classroom and the adult at the front and the students in a group. It's just this talk that goes on endlessly about delivering education is totally mistaken, isn't it? Students learn differently. The job of the teacher is to relate and respond appropriately to those differences among the students in aptitude and attainment and interests and motivations that really only in the school, only the teacher is going to know. Again, this seems simple to me, but I know it isn't simple to accomplish.
So, Mary Catherine, a couple of times Ted has talked about the importance of teachers. You brought up the same thing. earlier in your piece. What role is AFT as an organization doing to push the idea of innovation within the classroom, and how do you think that relates well to where Ted's going with his foot strategy idea?
Absolutely. No, it's a great question, and it's one we actually spend a lot of time working on in various ways. So I'll talk first from my own experience. When I was a classroom teacher and then new union president in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I wanted to address teaching quality, and I knew that I went kind of going into my own experience, and this is why I love Ted's containership example, because we didn't have someone 4 states away deciding that, if containers were organized, to be lifted off lifted off a truck and onto a ship, that would be more efficient. It was actually the people dealing with the containers. And I think similarly, when I earned my national board certification, I earned it because of the mentorship I got from other really accomplished teachers. And so when I became a new union president, I thought, okay, there's my experience, right? I have this community of accomplished teachers who helped me earn my national board certification. How do I replicate that? And when I was a new local president, I actually had having this conversation with AFT and saying, how can you, my national union, help me replicate this? And they said, well, what we can do is we can put you in touch with other innovators, right? Other teachers who are struggling with the same thing, other union leaders who are trying to bring the same, again, community of accomplished teachers to the center of their union. And that's exactly what they did, right? Serving as that conduit for ideas, because otherwise, my biggest frustration with even success stories in education is, one, we treat them like they are, they can't be replicated, like, oh, it's unique, it's this one situation. And we don't put a lot of effort into trying to replicate them in general. And so my experience as a local leader was that AFT puts a lot of effort into trying to replicate, trying to connect those people who, again, are all working in that same community of accomplished teachers, for example. And so that's how we brought peer assistance and review, for example, into St. Paul, because AFT connected us with someone in Toledo. We started talking about how we wanted to make it look a little different in St. Paul, but keep the strongest elements that were created in Toledo as part of our work, which then led to us thinking around redesigning schools. And to Ted's point, we had seen such a heavy top-down approach to restructuring schools. We wanted to reimagine what a school redesign would look like, and we did that. So then AFT served as like putting other people in touch with us as to how we redesigned schools, and so we spend a lot of time, whether it is handing out information or connecting people around labor management partnerships, which then trust people to create, to Ted's point, empowers them to have their own innovations in a labor management partnership, or whether it is still fanning the flames of peer assistance and review, whether it is looking at teacher-powered schools, whether it is the redesigned schools approach in St. Paul or the pro school approach in New York City, or whether it is the teacher-run schools approach in other places that Kim Ferris-Berg helps share, that I really do feel like our job is sort of conduit, connector, and then amplifying those great ideas that are around, because clearly people are hungry for them, and they're hungry for that community that is thinking creatively together. Great
points.
Thank you.
Greg, so Ted talks about innovation and improvement running side by side. We know in the authorizer world, there's some authorizers that are stronger than others for a host of reasons. What do you see, if you had to take 2 things from what Ted's just said to implement into your own work, what would those 2 things be?
Yeah, great question. It's interesting because what I see, I won't say more of, or certainly a fair amount of, in terms of the authorization of charter schools, is we have seen any number of cases of proposals for new charter schools being denied authorizers because they're not innovative enough. And I think this is one of the areas that we need to be careful of as we explore the concept of innovation in education. We've had school boards say, well, the proposal is fine academically, operationally, financially, but it's not innovative. And because it's not innovative, we're not going to approve it for the school to open. So we have to be careful in education, in my opinion, to not do that. For parents that might have otherwise sent their kids to that new school, a good new school close to home would have been an innovation. So we have to be mindful, in my opinion, of not turning down solid schools simply because they resemble schools we've already seen before. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of the concept of going to scale. As it relates to innovation. Ted had a lot of great examples in the book. There were a few around innovations in World War II, around folks that tried a new engine from one plane to another, folks that tried replacing a bomb bay with a gas tank so planes could have a longer flight. Those were innovations, but neither of them would have made any difference to the outcome.
Seems like we have a little technical difficulty. Okay, Rick's joined us.
Challenging ourselves to do that. And I see that happening. I'd love to see more of it. I see two kinds of folks in education that talk about innovation in two different ways. There are some folks that want innovation as long as it does not disrupt the current system. And then there are some folks that want innovation because they want to disrupt the current system. And I think both say they support innovation. It's important we understand whether you're working for innovation that doesn't change the system or whether you're working for innovation that will change it.
Hey, Gerard, can I ask Greg a question?
Absolutely.
If the sound is coming through okay. Greg, how concerned are you about the what some people describe as the encrustation of barnacles, regulations adopted by states, in states, or given to states as a part of the national program that have tended to make it perhaps more difficult both to form schools and to form schools that are in substantial ways different?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about it. We have three principles that guide our work at NACSA, or we say that authorizers should have three principles that guide their work. And one of those three principles is the preservation of autonomy, so that schools have the flexibility they need in order to be excellent. So it's something that we think is important at NACSA, and we do see more anecdotal evidence of creeping regulation. Most of those regulations, I think, are coming primarily in kind of a financial, from a financial direction, because there have been some cases of bad actors have misused money, and that tends to lead legislatures or even authorizers to implement new regulations to prevent the financial mismanagement. There have also been concerns around the question of whether charter schools are serving all kids or are treating all kids fairly. So that has led to some pressure to try to make sure kids are being treated well. So both of those are actually laudable goals. Spend public money appropriately, treat kids fairly, but they do lead to pressures for more regulation. Finding a balance on that is critical.
Yeah, sure. The essence of the school, the character of the school, is probably defined in the contract between the authorizer and the school as to what it is and how it's going to operate and what its objectives are and what its program of learning, pedagogy, and curriculum are going to be. Is it appropriate for the state entities, the state agencies, to go into the contract, or simply to make sure that the contract is consistent with these principles of public education that you just, and good management that you just expressed?
Yeah, well, one of the attributes of the charter school sector is that there isn't a single national charter school community. There are 43 of them, and each vary tremendously by state. And in some states, we have seen that it would be unnecessary and less inappropriate for the state education agency to go into the contract like that. In other states, there have been some problems and concerns around academic quality of schools, around financial mismanagement. And in those states, Minnesota being one of them, it led the legislatures to ask the state education agencies to get more involved. I do think in Minnesota specifically, this is really the first cohort of activity with the Minnesota Department of Education trying to figure out what their role is in this. And I think the one safe thing to say is there's a lot to learn, and I hope in the future cohorts, as they do this again, that they can get better at it in terms of what they're looking for, what they should be focused on, and what they shouldn't be focused on, because we don't want to have the state ed department re-regulating this space.
One of the things that I've heard, one consistent theme amongst all three of you, is the need for there not to be a top-down approach to reform, split screen or otherwise. I also heard a couple of you mention the important role of states and the local level. Ted, you end chapter 13, where you talk about taking a practical approach to the split screen strategy. We know in public policy things aren't always practical for a lot of reasons, whether it's driven by advocates, whether it's driven by others. How do we actually support the concept of personalized student learning to bring, or to, as you said, unite teachers and parents and young people in this work? How do we accomplish that in an environment where between money and politics, it's kind of tough to be practical? What would you tell the audience we should do? And then I'll open it up to Mary Catherine and to Greg.
Well, again, I think the object of personalizing, individualizing, and thereby motivating students as individuals comes out of the arrangement in which you encourage and allow teachers to be in charge to adapt the program. One of the concerns that we've heard a lot from teachers recently is how far the districts have gone in the other direction, essentially scripting teachers' work quite tightly. The more we can, as they say, empower and encourage teachers to adapt the program to those differences among students, the better we're going to be. One of the things, parts I like best writing in the book was that chapter drawn from the Jack Freimeyer conversation some years ago, where he simply starts with the importance of motivation. If students want to learn, they will, and if they don't want to, you probably can't make them. So every successful effort to improve student learning will begin by improving motivation. And one of the things I am finding myself doing more and more is challenging people to see who will stand up to defend a proposition that American school today is primarily designed and operated to maximize student motivation. The people who are going to get us there are our teachers, and the people who are going to get us there are the state officials and the national leadership that argues for this collective collegial empowerment of teachers. We have want to be very clear that this notion of the teacher calling the shots is not the notion of the solo teacher in his or her classroom shutting the door and doing whatever he or she pleases. One of the innovations that's developed in Minnesota is this concept of organizing school on the model essentially of a professional partnership, what we've today come to call teacher-powered schools, where the accountability is collegial and is therefore internalized within the teacher professional group.
Okay. Mary Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. No, I think actually, I'm just going to say I think practical is appealing.
Okay.
I like to think that we are reaching the end of this razzle-dazzle soundbite era, where the soundbite is actually more important than the attention to really smart implementation and healthy implementation. And so just to give an example of how practical is appealing, if we were to focus on the relationship teachers have with their students, and then of course their families, that is an incredibly practical place to focus, right? People understand that. It appeals to us as parents. It appeals to us as students. Like, yes, if I'm going to be in this classroom with you, I want the focus to be on how we are going to learn together, right? How we are going to work together. When you actually focus on how practical that is, it's incredibly appealing. And then it helps when we expose, to Ted's example, we expose this double speak of telling teachers you have to be engaging and you have to be scripted at the same time. That is, that is absolute doublespeak. Those things are mostly at odds with each other. When we expose that and we see how impractical it is to ask a professional to be scripted and ask them to be engaging to their students at the same time, we are completely ignoring and offending the relationship that student and teacher need, that teacher and their classroom of students need, or quite frankly that principal needs with that teacher. We are ignoring and we are treating those relationships like they don't matter. And yet, so I actually do think I think practical is appealing, and what practical means to me is focusing on what matters the most. And in a teaching and learning situation, it is that relationship, starting with that relationship between teacher and student and cascading out from there, that matters the most. And that's why I feel like practical is appealing to me.
Great. Greg?
Well, I have a vote in favor of practical as well. I started doing this work as was already mentioned, in Chicago almost 20 years ago. All of the folks who came forward to open charter schools in Chicago in 1996, 97, 98 were local folks. Many of them were teachers from within our school system. The Perspectives Charter School in Noble Street started by teachers from within our schools because they had some ideas. And even at that time, I remember speaking at a national conference of the National School Boards Association and talking about what we were doing with charter schools in Chicago. And folks in the room were actually upset that we were telling a story around supporting the opening of charter schools, because they thought, didn't we know that we were supposed to be against charter schools? It was an ideological argument. And they thought school boards were supposed to be against charters. Our response was very practical. We needed more good schools in our city. And if teachers or community organizations could start a good school, that's what we want. We owe that to our kids. So I think we will make progress in this endeavor if all of us, remain practical, focused on what's working better for kids, what's working better for teachers. Where we veer off track is when this becomes an ideological debate and there are sides trying to score points against each other. That's not going to lead to where we need to get. We stay practical, focus on new good schools for kids, we'll be moving forward.
So I'm in Washington, D.C. Last week, Congress voted to approve the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. I have a document that's 1,061 pages long. There's a lot of commentary, both good, bad, and ugly, about where this bill will likely take the federal government, how it would impact states, and how it would impact reform and also in families. From what all of you have gleaned thus far about the law, how do you think this can support the concept that Ted has put forward with a split screen strategy? And Ted, we'll start with you.
No, let me defer to Greg and Mary Catherine on this one.
Greg, we'll start with you.
All right, we'll start with me. Well, there's a lot still to learn about what's in that 1,000-page bill and how it will be implemented. A couple thoughts. One is that among those who have been proponents of accountability, kind of a standards-based approach to accountability and reform, there have been some hand-wringing that this bill is going backwards. And I understand their concerns. As I apply it to the charter school world, where we're seeing a lot of this innovation. Charter schools existed in this country for a decade before NCLB, and I really see the new bill is going back to a system that resembles very much the kind of assessments and accountability strategies that we had as a nation in the 90s. Now that is definitely a loosening of accountability coming from Washington, D.C., and it's transferring those powers to the states. And I think the real challenge now is to our states, to the state education leaders and educators throughout each state, to still maintain high expectations for themselves and for kids. So it's not an abandonment of high expectations and high goals for our kids. It's shifting where the power lands. And my hope is that leads to states being better, being smarter, being creative and innovative, and taking a lead and finding some new ways. That's my hope. I have a fear that in some states it might actually just lead to going back to the future. We're watering down standards, watering down cut scores, watering down expectations. So I think there's an opportunity, and we, from state to state, folks are going to have to decide how they want to respond. Are they going to rise to the challenge or not?
Okay, thank you.
Gerard, I think that, and this comes out of spending a little time last evening reading through summaries of the bill. Mm-hmm. I think there is an opportunity in this to make this turn in the basic theory of action. If there's a risk, it seemed to me, looking at this last night, that what it does is simply transfer from the national government to the states the same old model of trying to make school better without making it different. And the trick is going to be, as the discussion comes back to the states, for the state leadership to make the transition into the self-improving system. And in this, the charter sector, as we said, is going to be very important. Lots of our systems are two-sector or multi-sector systems. I mean, we have banks and we have credit unions, and we have investor-owned electric utilities, and we have REAs and co-ops, and the Catholic Church has the hierarchy and it has the orders, and public education is a two-sector system. It has the district sector and it has the chartered sector, and we're probably going to go along with this parallel system for quite some time, with hopefully innovations generating sooner in the charter sector and then being picked up by the district sector. We sure see that now with this effort to organize schools on the teacher-powered model. We had a meeting here in Minneapolis early November that I think you came out for, in which we had over 200 teachers from 23 states talking about how teachers collegially would take responsibility for actually governing and planning and designing and operating the school. And it was just fascinating. And half of those teachers, almost exactly half, came from the unionized district sector, and half of them came from the charter sector.
Mary Catherine?
Yeah, I would just build off what both of them said. I think we, of the many opportunities perhaps we have, I think what the reauthorization gives us is both an opportunity and an opening to restart these conversations and to make sure that we get to restart a conversation around what our constants are, right? What are our values we are holding firm on, and therefore what can our variables be? And that's what I'm looking forward to, and I think that's what what we're going to as AFT do to support our members across the country is help frame what a jump-started conversation gets to look like.
Great. Well, we have 4 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is I'll start with Greg and move backward.
Sure.
Within a minute or so, any closing thoughts you want us to walk away with?
Great conversation. Thanks for setting it up. Really enjoyed it. It is really important as a nation that we continue to push forward to find new and better and innovative ways in education. I am concerned that our dialogue in this country has far too much accepted the existing models as the models that must always be with us. It's critical that we push forward on this topic. I would just add that a reminder that not to encourage us to not view innovation and outcomes, measurable outcomes. We can't be viewing these as antagonists, as two different things. We have to choose one or the other. The purpose of innovation is to lead to better outcomes for students. I think sometimes in our conversations, folks feel like, well, if I support innovation, then I'm supposed to be against measurable outcomes for students, or vice versa. And that can't be the road we go down. Innovation is the means to the end, and the end is better outcomes, better life for kids. And if we keep those moving forward together, we'll be better off.
Thank you. Mary Catherine.
Thank you so much. I'm going to end just by an appeal to ask teachers and students and their families what comes next, right? What ideas do you have? What creative idea have you wanted to implement that you haven't had the opportunity to as already? And I don't think, I think some of this is big work. Some of it's work we can start tomorrow. I think asking yourself the question as a teacher, as a leader, as a parent, as a student, what power can we give teachers tomorrow? What power can we give them by June? What power can we give them within the next year? And again, not just thinking of that yourself, but co-creating that, asking teachers, what power would you want by tomorrow, right? What would you want us to build? What idea would you want to implement by next year? What's that going to take? What responsibility do you need to take to do that? Having conversation, like bringing teachers and students and their families into these conversations right away is a really practical place to start, as well as, I think, in some respects, an innovative place to start, given so many of the decisions that have been made absent teachers, students, and their families.
Thank you. Ted.
Thank you.
Well, this country is clearly, the education policy discussion is clearly thinking and talking now about a broadening of the outcomes. In the early stage, it was pretty much limited to the scores, to the kind of achievement and skills measured on the state assessments. We're clearly now thinking about broadening that out to include these non-academic, so-called non-cognitive skills. It's not an either-or. Some will be quantifiably measurable, some will not. Some will have to be measured by satisfaction in ways that people haven't quite yet worked out. My appeal, as I guess I say at some point in the book, is to recognize that all success is multidimensional. Concepts of quality are multidimensional. Think about anything you know. Judgments are made on balance. That's part of the transition I see us getting to. But I think there is a lot of hope. I said a year or so ago and did the earlier book, that I think this kind of change is necessary, and I'm comforted to think that things that are necessary tend to happen.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Greg, and for all the work you do at NACS. I want to thank you, Mary Catherine, for the work, the American Federation for Teachers, what you do, and particularly having been a classroom teacher. Ted, I want to thank you for continuing to push the American idea and the role education can play. And I'd like to end with actually something you said in your book. You said education policy, it means something more than the notion that change is something the boss does. In reality, we're all the boss. We're the boss as parents, we're the boss as taxpayers and voters, we're boss as educators and reformers and advocates. We all have a role to play. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for listening to today's Google Hangout. Again, this is Gerard Robinson, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for your time, and let's keep moving education ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much.